My buddy Mark is a paleontologist for real, like one of those dudes you see in the movies. Anyway, once he had a fossil hunting expedition planned and his usual group couldn't make it, so he asked me to go with him. I don't know anything about it, but he promised to train me and feed me, so I agreed. We went in his Ford expedition out to a secret location in the Badlands. I assume he had permission to go on this land, but I really didn't ask. He had his two-person tent in the back and a bunch of Dinty Moore beef stew, which isn't my idea of provisions, but I wasn't in charge of this thing. When we got there, it was late morning, but already hot. He gave me a hat and we started poking around this big, dry area of dirt and patches of grass. Part of it was a canyon, so it was like being inside a huge bowl. I got bored after about 20 minutes of watching him poke around, and I saw some strange tracks in the dirt that looked fresh. I asked him what he thought they were, and he said maybe a bird or something. It would have had to be a monster bird, though, because those tracks were as big as my feet. I followed them until they disappeared up out of the canyon, just because I was bored. They seemed to go into a grassy place and then off into a group of trees. I started Googling on my phone and I couldn't find any tracks that looked like the ones I'd found, at least not that size. It sounds crazy, but they looked the most like chicken feet. 3 toes with, in this case, huge claws. I asked Mark if he thought it might be a dinosaur, and he looked at me and told me to go drink some water. I did that and thought about the dinosaur idea. Thing is, this monster seemed to be walking on 2 legs. Finally, it got too dark to look anymore. I was starving, and even Dinty Moore sounded good. Mark got a fire going and heated up a couple of cans while I put up the tent. I forgot how bad I sleep in tents. Even though I was tired as heck from a day of wandering around in the canyon, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking I was hearing something walking around outside the tent, and I also couldn't stop thinking about those tracks. I guess I finally got to sleep, though, because next thing I knew, I smelled coffee. I went outside and Mark had another fire going and he'd made a pot of coffee and some box mix pancakes. I wanted to use the bathroom before I ate, but of course there was no bathroom out there. I went behind the tent and freaked out because I saw tons of those tracks right at the back of the tent, like the thing had been pacing around back there all night. Now, Mark had to be worried, I thought, so I brought him around the tent and showed him the tracks. He repeated that it had to be a bird. I put my foot next to the track to show him how big it was. I guess ostriches might have feet that big, but wouldn't we notice ostriches out here? And wouldn't they be out in the daytime, not just as night? Mark didn't have any theories, but he wasn't that interested, really. He just wanted to look for fossils, which was crazy to me. Why all the excitement about ancient dead creatures when we had a living one right around here? I was curious, but I wasn't scared until that night. I slept even worse than the night before, but Mark was out like a light. I got bored lying there trying to sleep, so I went outside and got another fire going. The fire made some crackling noises, but over it I heard something walking around. Not around, I realized, but toward me. A few seconds later, I saw it. I thought at first it was just a trick of the firelight, because what I was seeing was a dinosaur thing standing upright and staring at me with piercing yellow eyes. It looked like it was covered in snake-like scales, and it had a snake or dinosaur or maybe like lizard head. It kept coming toward me. I wanted to scream, but I was afraid if I did, Mark would come out of the tent and then the thing would get both of us. I didn't know what to do. I ran around to the other side of the fire, thinking that it might throw the thing off and at least give me a few seconds to think. I couldn't just run because who knew if I'd be faster, and I couldn't get in the car and leave Mark. While I was thinking, the thing was coming around the fire slowly. I couldn't figure out why it didn't just attack and get it over with. Reptiles are fast. It could have eaten me by now. I decided it was scared of the fire. At least I hoped it was. I grabbed a stick that was on fire. I didn't even care if I burned myself at that point. It was better than dying. I ran at the thing like a crazy person waving that stick, figuring I had nothing to lose. It worked. The thing started to back away and finally turned and ran up the ridge. Once my heart stopped pounding, I realized I had no way to convince Mark to leave. I wished I'd gotten a picture of the thing so he'd know I wasn't crazy. I sat by the fire until morning and it didn't come back. When the sun came up, I made coffee and breakfast and told Mark we had to go. I don't think he believed my story, but he agreed, probably because he'd found a good number of fossils anyway. I told him he shouldn't come back here again, at least not at night, but I doubt he'll listen to me. When my mom died, I had to drive from where I was working in Chula Vista, California, all the way Benson, Arizona to help with my dad. My sisters would fly into Tucson the next day, and it was on me to pick them up and keep things moving. I got the call around 6, so I knew if I left right then, I wouldn't get in until well after midnight. But I didn't want to sleep in my own bed, and I hated the idea of Dad being on his own, so I threw a bag together and hit the road. Thankfully, once you're on I-8, it's a pretty straight shot, so I could just turn my brain off. It was after dark by the time I crossed the border and hit Yuma, and the stress of it had me fatigued. To keep from getting too sleepy, I turned on the radio and tried to find something I could sing along to. Past Yuma is pretty much straight-up desert for something like 200 miles. Thankfully, the road is straight, so I could pretty much just let my mind wander. It was a weeknight, and after I cleared the suburbs, there was hardly anybody on the road. At one point, I drove over 10 miles without seeing a single set of headlights. After the better part of an hour, the radio started getting glitchy. Reception can be rough out there, so when it went to full-on static, I didn't think much of it and switched it off. My phone was on the dash giving me directions, and it started going crazy, too. It kept saying recalculating, then proceed to the route, then would cycle back over again. Whenever it seemed like it was about to grab onto a signal, it would jump back to square one. I was staring at it trying to figure out what the problem was, and it just went dead. It's not like I needed the directions right then, but I couldn't help needing to mess with my phone, so I unplugged it and pulled it out of the stand. It wouldn't turn on. Whatever loop it had gotten caught in bricked it. I kid you not, within 5 miles, a whole line of headlights sprang up out of the dark. They came up from the opposite direction, and when they got closer, I could see that they were taking up both lanes of traffic. Not wanting to get hit, I flipped on my brights so they would know for sure I was there. They didn't get out of the lane. To make things even more interesting, my car started to sputter, and the dash lights kept dimming and surging. With no other choice, I pulled off to the shoulder as far as I could without going down into a gully. Almost as soon as I put it in park, my car's electrical system went dead, just like my phone. Within a minute, this massive caravan of cars came up and rolled to a stop. There had to be over 30 trucks traveling in a pack. Everyone was a military vehicle, all lights up. One of the trucks in the front pulled nose to nose with me, and 2 soldiers got out, shining their flashlights on me. They came up either side of my car, and one of them knocked on my hood and called on me to get out. I didn't want to, but they made it pretty clear that if I didn't get out on my own, they'd pull me out. Once I was standing with them, they asked about my phone, cameras, or other electronics. I told them mine was dead, and they demanded I hand it over. I got it out of the car, and they checked it over before laying it face down on the hood. Then, one of them leaned back over his shoulder and waved for the line to keep moving. Everything started up at once, and the noise was shocking. Truck after truck rolled by, each one filled with soldiers eyeing me up. In the middle of everything was this massive flatbed truck, loaded down with something that extended almost to either edge of the highway. It roughly covered with a tarp, but it was clearly circular. The parts of it that I could see were smooth metal. I would have looked harder, but the 2 soldiers kept staring at me, making it clear that I shouldn't look too hard. Right behind this wide load were 3 trucks carrying boxy units on the back. They looked almost like refrigerator trucks, but with all kinds of pipes and panels covering them. The back loading doors were secured with heavy padlocks, and an armed soldier hung of the back of each. At last, the whole thing moved past me, and the 2 guys watching me got into action. One handed me my phone and made it clear that I should get moving. They climbed into their truck and sped off down the shoulder, I guess, to get back at the front of the line. I got back into my car and sat there for a little while, trying to sort out just what I had seen. After a bit, my phone screen lit up like nothing had happened. Taking that as a sign, I turned the key and my car started up like normal. It was well after 2 in the morning when I got to Dad's place, and I just went to bed to try and sleep. He had so much on his plate I never told him about the crazy military escort I'd seen the night before. A couple of times I almost convinced myself that I dreamed the whole thing, that I'd been so tired and emotionally drained that I'd nodded off and woke up on the shoulder. Maybe I did. But I remember the whole situation far too clearly for it to have been a stress dream. I had a really strange experience a few weeks ago I want to share. I told a few of my friends about it, but they just laughed at me and said I imagined it. I was rambling around Cades Cove in Tennessee, and I found this really cool cemetery with a lot of old headstones. I'm kind of a cemetery nut. I used to do a lot of charcoal rubbings. I find the designs on the old headstones so interesting, much more so than the modern stones. I had wandered around for a while, and I guess I'd gotten turned around. It was time for me to head on back out of the valley, since I had a 3-hour journey ahead of me, but I couldn't find the gate where I had come in. After about 20 minutes of following paths only to come up against yet another wrought iron fence, I was pretty irritated with myself. I started looking for another person to ask them where the gate was, but there wasn't anyone else there but me. I hadn't noticed it until I had to think about it, but the whole time I was in there I hadn't seen another soul. Now, I'm not the kind to usually get spooked, but I was starting to feel a little apprehensive. It felt like I was trapped in there. I pulled out my phone thinking I could pull up Google Maps. You know, that app can show you walking directions as well as car. But I couldn't get my phone to turn on. That's when I got really impatient with myself, thinking I'd let my phone die. And the worst thing was, I needed Google Maps to get myself out of Cades Cove. I was going to have to stop somewhere and ask for directions, and I hate doing that. I was seriously starting to think about hopping the fence. And then I noticed all the vines, wild roses, I guess, all winding through the fence, which means I'd most certainly get scratched up. I remember thinking, okay, that's weird. I didn't notice that before. And I started looking around, really looking now, at my surroundings. There were fresh flowers on a number of graves. That was another detail that I was sure I hadn't seen before. When I got in there, I had the impression it was just an old, forgotten cemetery, but obviously someone still visited and put flowers on graves. It was then that I noticed a person, some distance away, standing in front of one of the graves. I couldn't tell from where I stood if it was a man or a woman. All I could see was that the person was dressed all in black, which made me hesitate to call out. Like someone might be grieving, you know? I walked over there and waited, a respectful distance behind the figure. Now that I was close up, I could see it was a woman, in a long black dress and a hat like older women wear to church. I stayed silent, just waiting, figuring eventually she'd turn around and I could ask her which direction the gate was in. She eventually turned around and I was a little taken aback. The hat had a black veil that completely obscured her face. It was a little unsettling because I was unprepared. I couldn't even tell if she was looking at me. I said, "Excuse me, ma'am. I've gotten myself turned around. Could you please point me in the direction of the entrance?" She didn't answer, but started walking toward me, closing the distance. I wondered if her silence meant she thought I was rude to have disturbed her, since she was obviously in mourning. I quickly said, "I don't mean to bother you." No response, but she kept moving toward me until she was so close I had to take a quick step back, but she kept coming. Suddenly, I know this part sounds crazy. She wasn't in front of me anymore. I mean, completely vanished. I even turned around to see if she was anywhere in sight, but she was gone. I got chills all over. She looked real to me, but I wondered if I'd imagined her. And then I thought, who imagines something like that? A person that's not there. Which got me wondering if I had schizophrenia or a brain tumor or something. Don't laugh. These thoughts really went through my head, and it was a terrifying prospect to think of. Then I looked back at the grave she had been standing in front of. It looked freshly dug, and there were flowers at the base that I assumed the lady had brought with her. White daisies, bound with a red ribbon. I looked at the headstone, and that's when I really freaked out. I started to feel dizzy. The stone said Jonathan Wilkes, 1838 to 1889. I couldn't believe what I was seeing, so I closed my eyes for a minute and opened them back up. It was still there, and the headstone had one of those cool skull engravings that you see on old graves, except this stone looked new. At that point, I thought, okay, this is a prank someone is playing. That was the only explanation. I looked around to see if I could spot someone hiding, watching me, or maybe recording me. If there was someone there, they were doing a good job hiding. I even called out, "Very funny, but obviously fake," and waited. But no one came out of hiding. So I thought about the woman, and I figured finding her was the only way to keep my sanity. She couldn't have gone far. I walked around, following the path to the center of the cemetery. Since it was on a slight rise, I figured I'd be able to better spot her if I stood there. I'm walking along, going up the hill and looking around, and everything seems different. It took me a second to figure out why. Then I realized there were no fresh flowers on any of the graves. And also, what I could see of the fence from where I stood was completely bare. No wild rose vines. I literally got chills running down my spine. This looked like a different cemetery. I started moving quicker, close to panicking. Only one thought was in my head. I needed to get out of there, right now. I went to the nearest fence and climbed over, rather awkwardly, but still happy to be outside the grounds. Then I bushwhacked a little, heading downhill, and eventually found the road. 10 minutes later, I was in my car and glad to put that weird graveyard behind me. I got to a crossroads and automatically grabbed my phone before I remembered it was dead. But the screen lit up. It said there was 35% charge left. Add that to all the weirdness, and I couldn't get out of the area fast enough. When I got back, I told some of my buddies about it. They all laughed and said I'd imagined the woman, the flowers, the phone being dead. Then one of my friends who's familiar with the area got real interested, saying he'd never seen a cemetery on that road. So, in an effort to get someone to believe me, I agreed to go back with him, a few weekends later. We drove up and down that road and all over the area, but we couldn't find the graveyard. I swear it was on that road, but suddenly, it's gone. I'm seriously considering having a CT scan to make sure there's nothing wrong with my brain. Has anyone out there ever experienced anything like that before? I think I somehow stepped back in time, as crazy as that sounds.